about who you are, what you do.
Okay. My name is William Rees. I'm a population ecologist, but also the former director of the School of Community and Regional Planning here at the University of British Columbia. I did spend, up until I retired about 10 years ago, some 40 odd years studying the, I suppose, prospects for civilization in a rapidly changing world, and what we ought to be doing to avoid what seems to me to be the coming implosion of our Western society. So I'm basically interested in the physics and biology of sustainable development with a little bit of the human behavioral blockages thrown in.
You mentioned that you've been retired for 10 years, but obviously you're still very active. What is your focus now?
I guess I'm trying to get people to understand that climate change is not the issue. It's merely a symptom of a much greater problem that I call ecological overshoot. There's nothing novel about my calling it that, but that's where we are. Climate change is one of many co-symptoms, including plunging biodiversity, ocean acidification, land and soil degradation. I could, fill pages with the list of ecological issues that are all part of the same issue. And the basic problem is there are too many people consuming too much on a finite planet. And we've simply gone far beyond the capacity of ecosystems to restore themselves and to assimilate the wastes that the human enterprise is producing. So we're literally consuming the ecosphere from the inside out. We've become parasitic on the very system that supports us.
So what are the solutions if they exist? Because what we're talking about here is behavioral issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, overshoot, as I said, is basically defined as too many people consuming too much energy and material. And frankly, the only effective way of reducing overshoot is consuming vastly less energy and material, and that almost invariably would require a greatly reduced human population on Earth. In other words, we have to restore a relationship between human rates of consumption of energy and material and the ecosphere's capacity to recreate that, to recover. What do you call it? Restore it. So we have to go into restorative mode where the planet is allowed to rebound from hundreds of years of human abuse. So we've lost something like, a third of all the arable land that used to be on the planet. 70% of the surface of the Earth is significantly modified by human activity. So we've gone way beyond the regenerative capacity of the Earth, so that we couldn't even maintain the present population at current global average material standards for very much longer without undermining the integrity of the ecosphere. And that's something that people simply have failed to grasp. We tend instead to think in very, reductionist or simplistic terms. Okay, so modern humans have been around for perhaps 250 or 300,000 years. But we evolved under very simple circumstances, both simple social circumstances and ecological circumstances. So, say 10 or 15,000 years ago even, you would not expect to meet more than a half dozen or 20 people a day and perhaps 100 in your lifetime. Today, we have cities of many millions. 15,000 years ago, you would live in a very constrained ecosystem. Your home range would be a few kilometers from your place of birth, and you'd probably die very close to where you were born. And we had almost no impact of significance on the ecosystems that sustained us. Well, today, we live in a completely different system. So the contrast is this: we evolved to deal with simplicity, simple one-on-one reactions, linear cause and effect. It was adequate to think of one problem at a time because that's all that you really had to worry about. Today, we live in a complex world that we have created of overlapping social systems, technological systems, and ecosystems, any one of which is of such a complex array of behaviors that we can't wrap our minds fully around it. And yet they all interact in ways such that the first order interactions are simply beyond human comprehension. So the simple reality is that we're in a world in which Nobody fully understands any one of the major subsystems, and there's absolutely nobody in control. It's like being in an automobile headed for a cliff at 200 miles an hour, and all you've got is a speedometer and a gas pedal, but there's no brakes, nothing to tell you when you're out of fuel or anything else. It's an insane system. We're not in control, and to pretend otherwise is just foolishness and human hubris.
Apart from that, what gives you hope?
Well, I suppose if I have any hope at all, it is that at some point there will be a sufficient degree of information out there and a sufficient array of mini catastrophes that society as a whole will reach a tipping point. So right now I think we're in a state of global denial. Half the people aren't aware that there is a problem. Let's face it, this is not something that millions, billions of people who are malnourished or underhoused can afford to think about. They don't think about it. All they can think about is getting more, and justifiably so. Another quarter of the people who do know what's going on are in deep denial. I think most of the Western world is in denial about the nature of our predicament. So nothing happens. The momentum of global civilization, carried along by the absolute illusion of neoliberal economic theory, which says the only real and important value is efficiency. We need maximum rates of growth propelled by ever improving technology. This is our cultural narrative. It's the thing most people prefer to live by because it assumes that there's no problem too great for human ingenuity to overcome. The technology becomes our new God. It is a religion because people hold to it with the same degree of faith that they do to any other religion, with equal amounts of non-evidence to support their ideas. So we're in a situation of cultural denial, even as climate change is accelerating. We're losing 70% of the populations of many vertebrate animals that have been monitored. Insects have virtually disappeared from large areas. I mean, I won't get into that. That's just a pathetic thing to think about. But the point I'm getting at is the changes are so rapid and they're accelerating. And at some point they will come around and bite us in the butt. And when enough people have been bitten in the butt, we may reach a social tipping point at which people say, well, of course, how could you possibly imagine a culture growing indefinitely, consuming ever more and more in a finite environment? It's an absolutely ludicrous idea that only an insane person could hold to in the face of the accruing evidence. And when that happens, we may be prepared to make the significant changes necessary to move us beyond this. There will be a crash. We're due for, I think, a very significant population correction and a much reduced economy. So in my view, in the future looks like, let's wait. I suspect that if we ever do see a sustainable economy or civilization on planet Earth, it will be a much smaller civilization, or at least an economy that uses far fewer material and energy resources, supporting far fewer people who live in harmony with their ecosystems and with greater equity. So what we need to do is to adopt a way of being on the planet that is compatible not only with the regenerative and assimilative capacities of the ecosphere, but also with the fact that we evolved as a social animal. It's really ironic that 15,000 years ago, you couldn't live except in community. Individuals could not survive on their own. We are spindly, weak organisms in the face of a fairly hostile ecological system. And yet we've developed an economic philosophy in the last 50 years that destroys the concept of community, that destroys the notion that you need resilience in your systems. Instead, we've promoted the individual above and beyond all else. So it's every man for him or herself. So it's a complete antithesis to the nature of human beings as social animals who need community to survive. And I think we're going to either voluntarily or be forced back into a state where we live far more simply with much greater community stability and mutual reliance for mutual benefit.
Just two points here. One is, it's more of an observation, if you could just comment to to it, but it seems generally that people only respond to catastrophe if they've experienced it. It seems to be the way.
I think it's true that if you look historically at, there are many, many mechanisms for social change. What we're engaged in now is just social learning. But social learning is a process that takes 50 or 60 years, several decades at any rate, before you can move a significant number of people into thinking a different way. So rapid social change seems to take place often through revolution. I mentioned a moment ago the social tipping point, when sufficient numbers of people become radically aware of the perils that we're facing and take to the streets and demand that their governments do something in the public interest, for the common good, rather than for the corporate interest, which is where we're headed right now. One of the great drawbacks of the neoliberal economic revolution is that culture as a whole has adopted the values of the corporate sector. So most government decision making, in fact, many governments have essentially been captured by their corporate sponsors to do their bidding, and their bidding may not be in the public interest at all. So we need to see a resurgence of interest, or not interest, but I suppose, political focus on the common good, the public interest. And I think this is something that even ordinary people find very difficult to understand. There are 1,000 books out there, 101 things you can do to save the environment. But what people as individuals can do is trivial. This is a collective problem. It's caused by a culture that has a totally maladaptive cultural narrative or developmental paradigm. It can't be solved by individuals doing trivial little things like recycling their wastes, or you take your pick. There's lots of things. A shower with a friend to save water, and so on and so forth. We need large-scale, heavy lifting. That is to say, policies undertaken by governments for the common good. No individual can implement a program of rapid transit in our major cities where there is none. No individual can implement the corporate taxes, the carbon taxes, the consumption taxes, the pollution charges, and so on, needed to force the economy to, in fact, be more efficient, because right now we're simply externalizing all these costs, which means the economy is operating ineffectively and inefficiently. So, as I say, the heavy lifting must be done collectively by governments on behalf of the common good. What people can do as individuals may make them feel good, but it will have a marginal effect if that's all that happens.
Just on messaging, because you talk, your point about realism, pessimism, optimism, and stuff. Is it worth messaging? How do we handle that to the public, to buy-in?
Yeah, I'm often accused of being a pessimist. Others say you have to be much more optimistic. I've had articles rejected by journal editors because they're too pessimistic. Or at least if you want us to accept this article, you should end on a more upbeat note. So people are always looking for the good news. But the fact of the matter is that optimism and pessimism are very often just states of mind. They may or may not have anything to do with reality. And I hope that I'm a realist, because I, as a scientist, am following the actual trends in which we see various ecologically important variables going. And they do not paint a pretty picture. For example, just to put this in very concrete terms, the climate change movement is very optimistic. We have the COP agreements, or not agreements, but the COP meetings every year. We've had 26 meetings of the parties of interest around global climate change. We've had 6 formal agreements, including 2 that are allegedly enforceable. But that's all happened over the last 26 years, during which time there has been no significant change or reduction in the emissions of carbon dioxide. So we have this enormous meeting every year around the climate. We have new national commitments. We have all sorts of speakers talking about the need to take this seriously. And yet during that entire phase, we've seen nothing but a continuous uptick, in fact, an exponentially increasing uptick in carbon dioxide and other greenhouse concentrations in the atmosphere. So all of the enthusiasm and optimism around climate change that gets folded into these formal meetings and agreements has had virtually no detectable effect. Okay, things might have been worse had we not had that process, but the fact is we haven't reversed the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Things are getting steadily worse. I could name several others. We've had optimistic projections around the Biodiversity Convention, and absolutely no action of importance. Biodiversity continues to fall. We've had a convention on desertification. Everybody's enthusiastic about it, but nothing happens. Desertification proceeds apace. So one has to get realistic at some point and pay attention to what's actually happening in the real world. How can we talk about conserving biodiversity and restoration of our ecosystems during a period when something like, well, since 1970, of several thousand species of vertebrate organisms that are monitored, we've seen a population loss of some 70% on average. Hundreds of species have gone extinct. In this region, I'm a bird person, there's not a fraction of the bird populations that we have had. We've lost something like 97% of our barn swallows in the greater Vancouver region in the past few decades, 2 or 3 decades. So things are getting steadily worse, and people will at some point begin to take notice when it snaps and bites them in the behind.
So in a way, it's democracies that have been captured are not up to the job. And I won't use this, don't worry, unless you want me to, but if you were God, I mean, how would one address this?
Well, how would I address it if I were God? For one thing, I wouldn't have permitted the population to reach the point where the planet that I created could no longer support the levels of consumption that are out there. Look, this is a very complicated issue because the world community of those who are concerned are in great debate about whether it's overconsumption or population growth that is the issue here. Well, we can break that down. We can show now that it's absolutely true that the wealthiest quarter of people on Earth have essentially usurped the entire productive capacity of the planet. So overconsumption by those people has caused the present problem. On the other hand, we can also show that right now, the major forces increasing the human ecological footprint is population growth. So that the average levels of consumption by people in rich countries haven't changed much in 20 years. But as the population grows up, that's increasing numbers of people with huge footprints. So the entire increase of the impact of rich people is because of population growth among rich people. If we go right down to the other end of the spectrum, the poorest, say, billion people on Earth, their footprints haven't changed either. But their populations have more than doubled, say, in the last 30 years or so. And so the entire impact is the result of population growth. And we can go through each of the income quartiles or quintiles and show the same thing. So yes, overconsumption and inequity is an inordinately difficult problem to deal with. But you cannot deal with that without also dealing with the population question. So to separate those two things is an absolute waste of time. And there's another factor here. Our ecological footprint work shows that even if you were to redistribute wealth and income equally among the current 8 billion people on Earth, the average level of consumption is still too large for the current rates of ecological regeneration and waste assimilation. So even in total equity, we would have to reduce our throughput, the economic consumption and pollution, in order to stabilize our relationship with a currently destabilized situation. And by that I mean there's a certain bank, as it were, of natural capital out there. And the growth of the human enterprise right now is at the expense of depleting that capital. And at some point, it simply can no longer provide adequacy for growth or even maintenance of the existing circumstances, the existing population and natural or manufactured capital.
My very last question is, as a retired professor, what keeps you up at night?
Oh my goodness. I guess it's recognition that at many points in my life, back when I was a field ecologist and so on, I became so emotionally engaged in the natural phenomena I was observing on the tundra in northern Canada, for example, where I did my PhD studies. I was literally in tears over the sheer enormous beauty of the life process on Earth, of the living ecosphere. And as a scientist, absolutely astonished at the way in which all of this has evolved to keep the whole system going. After all, there's a limited amount of life-important material on the planet. But the planet, the ecosphere, Gaia, if you will, has organized itself in such a way as to use the continuous, unlimited throughput of solar energy to move all of that material in continuous cyclical manners. You and I each carry atoms and molecules that were once in the bodies of the dinosaurs. It's the same stuff that keeps recycling as life through the eons. To me, that raises, I'm almost in tears thinking about it right now. So the fact that most people are completely ignorant of this enormous story of incredible complexity and beauty and systems of recycling and energy flow that are beyond human imagining, and we're destroying it all out of sheer ignorance or greed or simple, you know, in some cases, absolute need, because look, we've got billions of people who are malnourished and they need stuff. And for us to condemn them for consuming is ludicrous. But there are others on their big yachts and private aircraft and so on and so forth who've gone way beyond the edge. And then there's a vast majority of people in the middle who are trying their damnedest just to get by, who may know a little bit, but not enough really to appreciate what's going on. We will not save that which we do not love. And until people come to feel in their bones that we are not apart from, but a part of nature, then we will continue to expand under this illusion that human technology is up to mastering and overcoming any of the barriers that emerge as a result of the breakdown of natural processes. Well, we're learning with the breakdown of the climate system that we have no control over this system. It's accelerating. It's happening much faster than the climate scientists predicted. And we're learning that in terms of biodiversity loss. We cannot slow it down unless we stop growing into the habitats and unless we stop appropriating the energy flows through ecosystems that would go to other species. See, people don't recognize that in the ecosphere, there is a constant throughput of solar energy. It's captured by green plants and converted into biomass for the use of all other organisms in the ecosystems. But it's a limited flow. And the more humans appropriate to grow the human enterprise, the less is available for non-human species. So when you hear an economist or a politician claim that there's no inherent conflict between the growth of the economy or the growth of the human enterprise and conserving nature, it's simply ignorance. There is an absolute direct conflict between human incursions into the habitats and to the energy flows needed by other species to sustain ourselves. So the more we appropriate the habitats of other species to grow food for the human enterprise, the less is available for them. The more we expose ourselves to zoonotic diseases, where we're seeing that right now, a new concern emerging in China. The COVID epidemic itself is allegedly from animal origins. We are messing up the system. We're beginning to disrupt it in ways that we can't predict simply because of the inordinate complexity of the system, and will not be able to control if we cross certain tipping points that are beyond, first of all, knowing. By definition, when you reach a tipping point, it's something that is there, but you don't know about it until you've passed it, and there's no return. So at some point, we may well cross climate tipping points or other tipping points from which there is no return, but which will prove fatal to some major proportion of the human enterprise, population, and economies. Okay. One of the things that most people don't really understand about Western civilization or modern technological civilization is that it's founded on a principle of what we might call human exceptionalism. The idea that humans are not part of nature. We are not like other species, and therefore not subject to the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. The fact is we are subject to the laws of physics, chemistry, and biology. But if we operate outside of that domain and pretend that we are not, we are bound to run afoul of the very system that sustains us. And that's what we're doing. We're destroying the very system that sustains and supports us. We're like a maggot in an apple, consuming the fruit from the inside until, guess what, there's no fruit left. And we haven't matured enough to go on to another apple.
Great, thanks for that.
And when I speak of exceptionalism, some people think I'm exaggerating, but it's not true. If you think of our modern economic paradigm, it explicitly designs an economy that is separate from and in no important ways connected to nature. So that the principal model of economics in most economics textbooks is something called the circular flow of exchange value. It shows a relationship between households and firms in a trading relationship. Households sell their labor and capital to firms in exchange for income, which the households then return to the firms for goods and services. So it's a double counterflow of money value. But the model is not connected to anything outside itself. So in other words, the entire economic enterprise operates as if it's utterly separate from nature. So it has no way of containing, or there's nothing in economic models, no important information about the dynamics or behavior of ecosystems, or for that matter, even the social systems with which the economy operates in the real world. What could possibly go wrong? Everything.